big week, Dan. Not the simple fact that we're back on a Friday during SmackDown, but the long awaited documentaries that everyone's been talking about, that everyone's been waiting on, that got paused twice, I think, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly from the cutscenes. Um, the Vince McMahon docu-series is available on Netflix. Came out on the 26th at 3:01 a.m. I mean, where do you want to begin?
I think I don't even know. I
Like,
think to like I think as we talk about it, we'll get into this. I think to sum it up, I oddly I can say like none of it surprised me, and then all of it made me realize that there's another side to him that has never been apparent, at least to the outside world. That is just a real life version of the character, right? Like that is maybe I don't even know how to say it, but I mean, like going through those episodes, it's like, yeah, a lot of these stories are everything we already knew, right? Like in the steroid trial and the way he was, and
I didn't.
obviously he had.
Yeah, I
I
didn't.
mean, there are little nuggets I think that maybe I didn't realize and stuff like that, but I mean, generally, we knew most of these stories, and we knew obviously like he had some very distasteful storylines in the past, and that's nothing new.
No.
Um,
And growing up
you
at the
know, but
time, you're just like, I can't believe they put that on TV. But like
yeah,
nowadays, and it could be just a change in culture, right? Nowadays, you're like, they would have never got away with that today. Like that's the first thing that just crosses
no,
through
of
your head.
course not. And I forget who said it in the documentary that said like, look, it might have been Triple H, I think, that said something along the lines of like, look, none of that would be something you could do today. He goes, but also who was worse, the person who put the storyline out there or the person who enjoyed every second of it?
Yeah, I
And
felt that was.
he's got a good point, right?
Yeah,
Like
I
to
just
me.
feel like that's a cop out though, like based on what's going on. Like to just say that to take some heat off your father-in-law. But I get it. Like we all enjoyed it at the time. But I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
I to sum this up, just for those who haven't watched it, I think I think like they could have called it Vince McMahon versus Mr. McMahon, and I think that would have the title itself probably would have summed it up because he even said a couple times in the interviews, there's like three computers going on in his head, right? One is the wrestling stuff, two is like his dirty stuff, and then the third one is just one that gets him distracted. And like the way he said that, it's kind of like, oh, he has ADHD. Like that's
Yeah.
so. I guess to get started, did you know about his childhood like this?
No, actually, that was the first thing I was going to say. And maybe I just never like really looked into it or ever paid attention. I had no idea that he basically was like what, an orphan almost. Like, well,
Pretty
not an
much.
orphan, but
Well, until
like
his dad came back around, right?
right, like he didn't meet his dad for till he was what, 13 they said or something. I can't remember the exact thing, but like I did not know that, and I also did not know that like him and his dad really didn't have that great of a relationship even once they connected. Um, so no, I knew none of that. So so that was a little surprising, and you know, makes me wonder too. Is that part of why he's effed up
Yeah, I mean,
as like internally, right? Like
it seems like when they talk to Shane, Shane basically acknowledges like that's why he doesn't have the relationship that he wants with Vince because Vince never got that from his dad, right? So like he never had like he never learned how to reciprocate that onto his own kids, right?
right.
And it's like, and it's sad because like I've like I feel by the time I got done with the documentary, Shane was my favorite big man. Like Shane was because like you could just see he did everything just because he wanted to be part of the business. Like he wanted to be in the spot that Stephanie was in. Like he wanted what Vince gave to Stephanie, right? And it seemed like it kind of helps that like Stephanie got with Hunter because then in Vince's mind, Stephanie did the right thing by finding a guy like Hunter that was in the business. So then that kind of already put her above Shane in like the family, you know, the family echelon. But yeah, it's crazy how it starts off. They talked about he grew up in a trailer, right, with his mom and his stepfather, and then his stepfather was very abusive and other things to him, and he had a very strong perspective on it. The way he talked about it, he said, he's like, I don't understand why kids carry this along for so much because if you survive the beating that they give you and you're alive, then you basically beat them. Like that's what he said, and it's kind of like, oh, well, that's, and then right there you could just say like, okay, something's off, right? Like, and it's not that we thought like we didn't think like something was off with Vince beforehand, but like we just didn't know like I guess what was the causing effect of it, right? Like we just didn't know
Yeah.
what actually was the catalyst between like, oh, Vince can't blur the line anymore between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon. And it seems like some part in his life with how successful he became or how big WWE got or when they went public or when they opened up the restaurants, which I forgot about. I forgot about the WWE restaurants in
I
Times Square.
remember. Yeah, I remember there was the restaurant. I do remember the restaurant in Times Square. There was something else I didn't realize. What they did right before the restaurant, I didn't realize they did. The casino.
Yeah.
Didn't they do something with the casino? I
Yes.
didn't remember that.
Yeah, I didn't know. I
I mean, we were a lot younger, so I guess we wouldn't be as in tune with that stuff.
yeah, well it was Totelling Casino. Uh
Yeah.
yeah, in late 1999, the company would win the bid for the property of then Debbie Reynolds Hollywood Hotel when the building would go up for sale in 98. And then the initial plan was to make a 35-story wrestling themed hotel. Oh, there he is. And yeah, so it's like that was crazy, right? Because it's like that would have been awesome. A 35-story wrestling themed
Yeah.
hotel. I'm in. Like, tell me where to sign up. But yeah, like it's just these small things, right? Like, and then I don't know, like it's and it's weird because so let me see how I can put this. Every time Shane talked, Shane explained how he tried to do whatever he could for the business to get the respect from his dad, right? And
Yep.
spoiler alert, towards the end of the first episode, Vince says the only time his dad told him he was proud of him is when he saw how big he was getting, and then his dad said, "Fuck him, go steal everybody else's wrestlers like you've been doing." So it's like Vince Jr. already like started to go take everybody's, top stars and was getting death threats, and they said they were going to drown him in water and all these other things. And then it finally started to work, and they got big and they were growing, right? And then his dad saw how successful it was, and then his dad finally said, Vince, I'm proud of you for what you're doing. Keep doing it. You're going to take over the business, right? And then
Yeah.
I believe his dad shortly passed away shortly after that as well. So it's like that probably had some effect.
And really, like, wasn't that the story too? Like, he really only told him he loved him the day before he died.
Yeah, well, yeah, he loved them and that he was proud of them, and he said, "Fuck everybody else, go steal them, go steal the wrestlers like you've been doing, or go steal their stars, or something like that." So he basically finally got the approval to like go do what he's been doing the whole entire time, right? So, and then obviously, like, not to rehash on stuff that they already know, um, but like they talked about the first WrestleMania and how if that failed, Vince was probably going to go under if that did not work out, right? Um, and how big that was for the culture, and like Stephanie said, um, to her grandparents, obviously Vince's dad and mom, mortgaged everything they owned for WrestleMania, like everything. And I guess like which was weird at the time because Vince was I think it was Vince that was walking around the house saying that this is gonna work, this is gonna work, this is gonna take off. But Shane said like they never really talked finances in front of him or Stephanie. Like they always kept that close to the vest, I guess. So like they could never tell if something was off with that or business was bad. Um, you know, and then next episode, I mean, just to rehash, that sums up pretty much the highlight from episode 1, right? His dad, the interviews with Shane and Stephanie, the Mania, how big it was, um, and shows how stupid I was. I didn't know Tony Atlas's real name.
Oh,
I thought for sure. I thought that was his legitimate name.
oh, that's funny.
But he has a.
Yeah, Anthony White.
Yeah, it shows you how stupid I am. So I was watching that, going, "Oh, I'm a dummy." Um, but yeah, so it was good to see Tony Atlas because for him being such a legend, I feel like I don't hear from him at all on these wrestling podcasts or whatnot. So for them to be able to get him, that was pretty cool. Um, yeah, I mean, and then they talked about like the start of Hulk Hogan, right? And like people forget, like Hulk Hogan started off as a bad guy or a heel at the AWA days. Like that's what he started as. Um, so eventually, when it came time for him to take the turn, it wasn't as hard as people thought. But you know, um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, is there anything else you want to uh, touch on from episode 1 that caught your mind? That's pretty much all the notes I had.
Yeah, nothing else. Nothing else that. Um, yeah, that like the big thing was his relationship with his father. So,
And it basically came down to
um,
it was non-existent, right? And
yeah, there was no relationship really.
no, unfortunately not. So then episode 2 they started to get into the real spicy details, you would say, you know? The real you had to buy this book from a certain bookstore type stuff, Dan. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which side note, can I tell you how happy it makes me to see how aggravated it makes Bob Costas to talk about the XFL? Like Bob Costas has done
It becomes a
everything in the
little.
sports world, but like
Yeah,
he's so aggravated by Vince and XFL still to this day. Like I thought
yeah.
Bret Hart was bad. Bob Costas might be right up there. Like,
I think Brett's still way worse.
but like,
I think. I think. I think Brett is still way worse, and we'll get into that a little bit, I'm sure.
but I just love that because that comes up right, Bob. I think Bob's first part of the interview is in episode 2, from what I can remember. Um, and then of course we have Uncle Dave in here, so he just loves the FaceTime. Um, but they talked about how Vince used Saturday Main Event to build bigger stars, which is ironic because they're bringing back Saturday Main Event supposedly. Um, so that's cool. Um, yeah, I mean, like I guess the big point that I had for episode 2 was the whole unionizing for the wrestlers, right? What Jesse Ventura was
What
trying
Jesse
to do,
tried, yeah, and what Hulk Hogan
blew him in.
stopped him from doing.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I does this. I guess let's take a step back. After watching all 6 episodes of this, does it change the way you feel about Hulk Hogan?
no, not really. I mean, I think the problem has been for Hogan is that later in his life, he just and Eric Bischoff, who's one of his best friends, talks about this all the time. Him and Kevin Nash, he says the same thing. After a while, when you've told stories 1,000 times or thousands of times, the details start to get a little fuzzy and the
Yeah,
stories start to change because you probably are just you know taking a little poetic justice occasionally because you can't just say it verbatim every time.
right.
um and Hogan just kind of misremembers, I think, right, a little bit from time to time. um I think, I mean, I knew, I think it was pretty well known, the blowing Ventura in on the
See, I didn't
on
know
the
the extent of that. Like, I knew there was bad
oh
blood there,
really?
but I didn't know like the actual extent of that. So it was cool. So
I've
talk
heard that
about that
story
for a bit.
before. Yeah, I've heard that story before because Ventura has never been shy to talk about it because he it came out officially during the steroid trial when they like deposed him and then in testimony and stuff like that. So it came out during deposition that he had, blown in Ventura for trying to start the union and the reasons why. And that's when Ventura pretty much lost all trust with Hogan and why he says to this day they could never repair their relationship because he'll never trust him again. And that's, he can't be a friend with a guy who he doesn't trust. And now Hogan just admits it. I think before he never really talked about it, but now he doesn't care.
Yeah,
Um, but I mean, it doesn't surprise me, right? Because who stood to lose in a union for wrestling? The guys at the top,
correct.
right? For the better good of the wrestling community, sure. And all the people in the locker room, it would have been great, most likely. But for a guy like Hogan, especially at the time, it would have sucked because that money would have started to be shared,
Yes.
and there would have been so much more expenses, and your payouts would have gone down so much lower. So it doesn't really surprise me. So does it change much? I don't think it changes much for me, but like I think generally speaking, my overall opinion of Hogan the guy has changed as I've gotten older. Like Hogan the wrestler though is still like just like on a Mount Rushmore for me,
Yeah,
like
he
in
kind of has
general.
to be right just because of what
Right.
he did. Like,
Yeah, and certainly like in for I mean for us and certainly for me, like Hogan was the guy when I was a kid during a more PG type era and just like craziness surrounding Hulkamania and Hulkamania running wild and all that stuff, and then basically becomes one of the main guys in
yep, which we'll
the
talk on.
second
Yep.
the second best period of or maybe the best period of wrestling for me, with the second best being when I was a kid. Hogan is a main player in both those situations, right? So for me personally, and that's just our age bracket, like I can never lose that. But yeah, the person, just as I've grown older, like some of his stories are just ridiculous, right? He's just that he's become that guy that just remembers things kind of crazy and like
Well, and
and just kind of
not to jump ahead,
makes
but like
makes makes shit up.
the way that Steve Austin says he's not a CTE guy because he believes if you get that many concussions, the problem is not CTE. The problem is you're not wrestling the right way. Which it's like, Steve, you remember you got your deck broken on a pile driver? Like what? Like So
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting comment that he's not a
so
CTE guy.
I'm
Like
but like
I do agree with his point. Like if you're
yeah,
getting concussion after concussion, maybe you aren't wrestling safe, but that doesn't take away the importance of being
well,
careful about
and it's
CTE.
cause and effect, right? Because if you're smashing your head, you're gonna get concussions, right? Which he admits to. And then the outlier for concussions are you're gonna get CTE because the brain's not meant to take that pounding. So it's
Right.
like, yeah, it's interesting, man. It is.
I mean, clearly Vince isn't a CTE guy either.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
yeah, I'm sure that has nothing to do with the use of things that they've talked about, but yeah, it's something. Yeah, I mean, but then like I I kind of thought it was funny how like they talked about the union issue with Hogan, right? And then they said, "Well, yeah, Jesse was in charge of it, but let's be honest, like once it actually came down to it, none of the guys were actually going to go along with Jesse because they didn't really because Jesse didn't really have that type of pull in the locker room." And it's like, so you're just basically, it felt like they were putting that excuse out there just to like overshadow the fact that Hogan just cried to Vince about this. And it's kind of like, you don't have to protect Hogan. Like he's no longer involved and Vince is no longer involved. Like you don't have to like do this anymore. Like just say what you got to say. Um yeah, and then after that they talked about WrestleMania 2 and how that was a disaster basically.
yeah.
Well, not like a disaster, but Vince said afterwards, or Vince said when they were trying to fix the technical issues they were having at the time, we are never doing this again. So, like, I think Vince got overzealous about like what he could actually have WrestleMania do, like broadcasting in 3 locations at that time. With let's be honest, like limited technology compared to now. Um,
Sure.
was still wishful thinking and still shows you like Vince was the guy to push the wrestling, like push a wrestling event like forward. He was like the visionary, as people call him, because that's ballsy. That you like, say if WrestleMania 1 was a failure, you're not surviving to WrestleMania 2. So for Vince to just say, okay, let's double it up, double or nothing. We're going 3 simultaneous events. Like that's crazy to me. That they like barely needed that they needed everything to go right on episode 1 for it to even come close for like for WrestleMania 2. Um so I mean, yeah, they talked about it. And then this is when Vince flew to Andre, right? To get to get him back cuz he was shooting a low budget film. I forget what it's called, but I used to have it on VHS. Um and he basically convinced Andre to come back by saying that it's going to be at 80 to 90,000 people. And he basically said Hogan can carry you, right?
Yeah.
Because his back was that bad up, right? Like he wouldn't get, or Vince had to convince him to take time to go get the surgery. And then Andre came back after the surgery because Andre didn't want to go get the surgery. Um, yeah, sorry, he said 93,000 seats, Andre. And then that's kind of what got him to come back. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know. Thoughts on episode 2? Like, it felt like the start of the crazy train just beginning.
Yeah, I mean, I thought for sure the first 2 episodes they just kind of touched on things a little bit, right? And then
Well, and don't forget WrestleMania 2, they had the WWF and the NFL Battle Royale.
Yeah. Did they talk? I don't remember them talking about that
No,
all
but
that much.
yeah, that's just in my the WWE history book that I have. Yeah. So that was cool.
Um, yeah, I mean, the first two episodes, they kind of got a little bit into they touched on some of the initial scandals in episode two, and then from three on is when we really got into it.
Yeah.
So,
But just to go over WrestleMania 2, uh the the IC match was Macho Man versus George the Animal Steel to retain his title. We had Jake the Snake versus George Wells. We had the boxing match, Mr. T with Joe Frazier, and then Tatey Kid defeating Roddy Piper with Cowboy Bob Orton by disqualification. Fabulous Moolah beating Velvet McIntyre to become the new champion. We had the flag match, Corporal Kirchner defeating Volkanov with Classy Freddie Blassie. The Battle Royale, like we said, and then the World Tag Team Championships. Ricky the Dragon Steamboat defeating Hercules. Adorable Adrian Adonis with Jimmy Hart defeating Uncle Elmore. Terry and Hoss Funk with Jimmy Hart defeating Tito Santana and Junkyard Dog. And the main event, Hulk Hogan, all juiced up on steroids that Vince didn't tell him to take, versus King Kong Bundy with Bobby the Brain Heenan to retain. Yeah, I mean it's wild, man. It's well, and so yeah, episode 2 they talked about, or episode 2 they briefly talked about the steroid trial, right? Episode 3 is when they got into it.
well, three was more of the Montreal screw job, but they kind of laced
Okay,
that in throughout
so
it. So two they talked about it as well, but
quick question
yeah.
for you, since my ADHD kicked in. Did you know the full story about Wendy Rickner?
Um, so not the full story, but I do remember hearing that it wasn't the first time. Like the Montreal screw job was not the first time that it happened, and not the first time it had happened in WWE, WWF, and not the first time it happened in wrestling. Cornette has talked about how this has been done multiple times in promotions and was done in the territory days several times. It's just nobody really knew because there was no coverage of it. Um, but what I didn't know was that it was quite as orchestrated, and then her reaction to it, where she essentially tried to have a real fight after that. Um, I didn't know that part. I did know they had done that to her though, only because of Cornette though.
I briefly heard of her in the past, so it was good to hear the full details of the story, and now going back and researching some stuff after they talk about her and whatnot. She deserves to be talked about more, because when they talk about the women that helped them get to the Divas Revolution, if you go back and watch some of the footage of her, she was actually wrestling. She wasn't just a side piece. She wrestled.
Oh yeah.
She was an athlete at the time, and from what Eric said on 83 Weeks today, because he was reviewing episode 2 and 3, he said she was an athlete. She was an athlete before they were athletes in there. So it's
Yeah, women's wrestling has had a weird up and down
yeah,
because they they had it for a while, and Moolah and all of them
yep,
too, right?
yeah,
And then that went away, and then it came back as Divas, and then it went back into women's wrestling. Uh, It's had a weird history for sure, but yeah, it's weird to think that like Wendy Richter and Moolah and Medusa and all these others that had actual like a lot of wrestling in a time when, we were told women weren't equal, and then that somehow it just went away,
Right.
and then it disappeared, and then it resurfaced as, just the sex kittens of wrestling instead, essentially. And there was some wrestling but very little, and then
Yep.
WWE, really bastardized it, right? And made it just bra and panties matches basically, and then all
Softcore
of a
porn
sudden,
after 9 p.m.
yeah, right. And then after a while, there started to get some real wrestling in it. Trish and Lita and them like started to get more to wrestling. But they couldn't get away from the bra and panties crap 100%. And then boom, that went away, and then you had the women's revolution or evolution, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it.
Yeah.
So
But yeah,
but it's funny to call it an evolution because it really was just a return to what it used to be.
correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like they don't give enough. Like, there needs to be more about that, right? Like,
yeah.
discuss, because I feel like they don't. Jeez. All right, Dan. Now this is where it gets spicy.
Yeah.
I'll let you take it. Screwjob episode. Let's go, brother. How are we feeling?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this was really focused on episode 3. Like, yeah, the screw job was a big part of that episode, but it was really the WCW relationship or competition, right? Which led to the need for the screw job, right? I when it comes to the screw job, I know at the time it was just like craziness and whatever. I I don't know if I guess I understand it at the end of the day, because as a wrestling fan then I didn't understand it. As a wrestling fan today, looking back on how cutthroat that competition really was and how much of a war that really was, and how much of a look, we might go out of business that really was for them. And then hearing the full bore story on the Richter deal. And I mean, everybody remembers this and knows this, but Medusa, Lundra Blaze, right? She brought their championship onto WCW TV.
Yep.
And that's like an overlooked thing, maybe because people didn't think much of it at the time and it was just the women's title, whatever they wanted to say. But she threw it in a garbage can live
Live on
on
TV.
Nitro, and there was nothing the WWE could do about it. And you I don't doubt anyone that says Bret Hart would not have allowed that. I also don't I believe Bischoff that says he wasn't interested in doing that with WWE's title, but I also don't feel that had the opportunity arisen and made sense at the time, that Bischoff wouldn't have done that either. Because if that would have put the final nail in Vince's coffin at the time, why wouldn't Bischoff have done that?
Well,
Why
and
wouldn't Bischoff do that?
and
Right? Like,
I think Eric shares the same point of view that Vince says, right? Like, when Vince was talking about Wendy, he said 2 or 3 times, "I would do whatever I'd have to do for this business," right? And I think,
and to
and
protect
we
it.
know that Eric was the same way, right? Like, he probably didn't feel right about doing it, but noting he had to compete, he would have said, "This is what I got to do."
I mean, I tend to think back then that I don't think, well, Eric says it all the time. He has no regrets about anything he did.
He probably doesn't.
And no, I believe him for sure. And also, I think, I don't think he would have thought twice about doing it, because at the time he really did want to put Vince out of business, and like and slay that giant. And what a way to do it. Now, whether or not Brett would have done it, I don't know if Brett would have done it. Like Brett seemed like a pretty loyal guy. Brett seemed, like he probably would have felt that it was wrong to do that with that belt, and that wasn't what he was going to WCW for. But Vince can't take that chance. So you just can't take that chance. So you do what you did. And in the end, I mean, it literally was the catalyst for potentially the greatest era in wrestling ever.
Yeah,
So,
it's. I don't think it'll ever be beat. Right.
right. So it's like, obviously, he didn't know that in the moment, but he turned it into becoming the greatest wrestling era, right? And the Monday Night Wars as part of that era, and then the Attitude Era, right? Like, I mean, it couldn't have been any better. So it worked, and I don't blame him. So, but he felt the pressure. I mean, they always say it. Actually, this is funny because the one thing that didn't come up in this documentary that has been said a million and one times on every podcast by every major person involved in that was, I don't know if you would have caught this or not. In general, it's just something that stuck in my brain. I was waiting for Eric or Bruce or Vince to say this one line, and none of them did. And it was, things got so bad we were removing the water coolers from the building. That is talked about as like the one sign that WWE was on the brink of collapse. And they always talk about the day that the water coolers were removed. It didn't get brought up, and I was waiting for it, and then it never happened. Um
No, but they did.
but
They did go
but
into
it's true.
detail of WWE getting its ass kicked during this time.
Oh yeah, I mean,
They
Vince
did,
Vince admitted that it was almost the end.
and
It was
I
almost
loved
the end.
how they gave Eric the cut screen to say WCW was winning for 83 weeks straight, like 6 or 7 times. And he goes, by the way, that's the name of my podcast, 83 Weeks with
Yeah.
Eric Bischoff.
Was it 84? No, it was 83. Yeah, oh no, that was great.
Yeah.
You could tell he had a blast with it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. Yeah. He obviously
Um
did. But yeah, so episode 3, title screen, and then I believe is it Vince walking into the court with the brace on, right?
um
Was that, or am I ahead? I'm I'm
I
trying to think.
I I I can't remember specifically now. I'm looking at this little recap. It says it started with them rehashing the Wendy Richter thing. That's kind of
Yeah,
let's
because they
just
kind
touch
of,
on what we
yeah.
did.
Well, because that's kind of what they did throughout, right? They would talk about something in the previous episode and then tie it up at the end, at the start of the next episode, right? But, but yeah. So I have here that yeah, episode 3 report screw job. Yep. So title screen, and then Vince is sporting the neck brace as Hulk Hogan is brought in to testify. Now this
Yeah,
is
they kind of
wild.
they kind of weaved all of those
Yeah.
storylines together. I don't remember the exact timeline on that, but I know it all played into look, this trial was another thing that nearly sunk us,
Yeah.
and then WCW
Yep.
all of a sudden came out of nowhere.
So
It was, I mean, they mentioned that too. It was one thing
after
after
another
another.
for the McMahons. Yep. So
Right.
did Hulk Hogan? I'm trying to think now, because he was only going to testify if he got immunity, which he did. So did Hulk Hogan basically say he used the feds and then didn't tell them what they wanted to hear because he
He
was
did.
protect McMahon, right? That's pretty much
He
how you took
he
that,
is
right?
he is I mean, I don't, yeah, I'm not sure there was any other way to take that. He basically said,
Well,
I
so
told them I'd give them everything they needed, and then I got there and I just said nothing they wanted to hear. he duped them for sure.
Well, so
Um,
Wade Keller talked about it more of from PW Torch as he was sitting there throughout the whole trial. He talked about it from the Fed's perspective is the Feds thought they finally got him. And Hulk
yeah,
Hogan was going to give them what they've talked about previously. And then when Hulk Hogan showed up, that's not what it was. So
yeah.
Hulk Hogan um outsmarted the Feds.
Yeah, I mean, I guess he did. What he probably got was just a couple of feds that were too eager to try
Bottom
to
of the barrel
convict,
Feds.
right? Who wanted to make a name for themselves, wanted to have this on their resume, got real eager, didn't vet it properly, and then boom, they had egg on their face because what a terrible witness for them. What an absolutely terrible witness. But in fairness, when it comes to this whole story, and I think
So there's something
I
in here.
tend
Yeah, go on. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think Tony Atlas probably said it the best. And I think the way Bret Hart talked about it is how we know it's mostly true. Bret basically said, and we know Bret is not going to take an opportunity to shit on Vince McMahon or Hogan or any of them. Bret said, look, I don't actually believe he sold them to anybody. I think, I didn't see him ever give them to anyone. We were doing it on our own. And Tony Atlas kind of said, yeah, he wasn't the dealer, but it was wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, hey, if you looked bigger, you probably would have a better spot in the promotion.
Yeah.
So it was implied like, look, there's stuff out there that will help, and that will get you a better position.
Well, and what was Vince's
Go to
go-to line that they
go to
used?
town.
It's like, "Oh, it looks like you haven't been training hard enough." That's what he would tell these guys.
Right. Right. So I do think the Feds probably screwed up in that, and I mean I don't know for sure, but I don't know that Vince was really the dealer. I think Vince was an enabler. I think Vince was a guiding light to steroid use. He was using them too. It very much could have been a hey, look what it's doing for me, and I'm not even one of you guys, right? Like, um, I don't know that I believe that the feds had it right that he was dealing it. I'm sure
No,
he was helping. I have no doubt in my mind he was probably helping, but these guys were big boys. I'm sure they knew how to get it, you know.
yeah. I mean,
Because I think Brett would have said, "Oh no, hell yeah, he offered to get him for me."
well,
Like,
I'm sure. I'm
why would
sure.
Brett protect him?
No, and I 100% agree. I think it was more of like how it was explained, right? That Vince had that go-to line of stating, "Oh, it looks like you're not training hard enough again," and then go see doctor such and such for your, for your workups or whatever, and then that doctor would be the one because they got in trouble with a certain doctor at the time too. Remember? But
Yeah, they had. I mean, the doctor for sure was dealing, right?
yeah,
Like prescribing and selling, which was the problem.
so here's the big thing that I found interesting with Wade Keller on 83 Weeks. Are you aware of the Ring Boy allegations?
Um, I had heard of that in relation to a Pat Patterson thing one time, but I did not know the details of
So
it.
the
Oh,
the alleged detail is basically Mel Phillips, Terry Garvin, Pat Patterson accused of sexually abusing underage boys brought in as a crew for WWE shows in 1992. So Conrad asked today, do you think the steroid trial started to be the thing that they were going after Vince for? Or there's a conspiracy about it. Do you think the Fed started to take a look based on what they heard, what was going on with this Ring Boy allegation, and thought we might not have enough to get Vince on this because you're going to need testimony from everybody involved. You're going to need witnesses and everything. We have a better chance to get him on the steroid trial. So then that's why they brought the steroids after him, right? Because
Yeah.
they probably figured that, though pun intended, but they probably figured their hands were cuffed on the Ring Boy allegation and thought, well, this is our next best chance. Which
Yeah.
at the time, like, it makes sense. Like, if you think about like all the politicians we see getting in trouble nowadays, it's always they started getting looked at because it's something else, and then it just spins into something else down the road, right? And then they will get you what they can get you for, and they probably thought the steroid trial was going to be the thing they could get Vince for, but even my favorite Uncle Dave said there's no way this should have been brought to trial because they had no evidence.
No.
And they couldn't
No,
rely on Hogan, which they found out the hard way.
which they clearly didn't.
Right.
Like I said, they didn't vet properly because
Right.
obviously what he told them wasn't, whatever he told them or intimated to them, they should have deposed him first and figured out what he knew or what he was willing to say under oath. And clearly they didn't because, they obviously didn't bring him up on any kind of perjury charges or anything like that. And they had nothing to leverage him with because they didn't have him caught on illegal use because for the longest time steroids were legal. It was just the process in which they got them was illegal.
Right.
The doctor wasn't allowed to sell them after prescribing them.
Right.
And
So they were
that's what he
basically
was
just
doing.
trafficking them back then. That's what it came down to instead of
Right, because there's nothing
staying within
illegal
the
about it in
protocols.
the first place.
Right.
So they screwed up, and it probably is a vendetta issue, right? And there was, they talked about it a little bit in the episodes in general that there were certain reporters and journalists that, for better or for worse, just had a hard on for Vince and wanted to take
So
him down.
funny you bring that up because when Bret Hart was asked about Mel Phillips, he said Mel Phillips was a total pedophile that preyed on young boys, and if these young boys weren't complying with the request for sexual favors, they weren't hired. I do think there was a lot of turning a blind eye to some of the things that were going on, but I don't think anybody could ever prove it. It was like, how do you prove it?
Yeah.
But then McMahon goes on and says Phil Musnick was trying to build this whole case on how rotten the company was. He didn't care how he did it. He didn't care whether he hurt the people involved on one side or the other. He just wanted to write a salacious piece about WWE. And Musnick on the allegation said it was a pedophile ring. 3 of these guys were all in on it. These were real kids being sexually abused on Mr. McMahon's watch. So, which ties back into the trial because, like, I definitely see the feds become aware of Vince and what's going on in the company because of this, right? If any of this gets out, the feds just say, all right, let's take a look over here. But now, to just bounce back to the trial, do you think it took... So there's also... Conrad brought this up too, because he's a little bit into the conspiracies like I am. And not, full-fledged, but, we'll save that for a different podcast.
Yeah. Not a wrestling one.
Yeah, not a wrestling podcast. But Conrad brought up the point to Wade Keller based on what Rick Rude said in the trial. Is that why it took him so long to get into the Hall of Fame? Or is Rick Rude even in? Is he even in? Yeah, he's in, right?
Is he in? I don't... Is he in as part of DX? Yes, he is.
No, supposedly he's not.
Yeah, he is. I'm on their website right now. He was in the class of 2017. He wasn't alive for it.
So yeah, so then so that's where it stems from. Sorry about that. Do you think Vince was that petty?
Because
yes, I could see Vince being that petty.
I think we learned in general that I think an overarching theme throughout this was that he blurred work and personal a lot, which included finding ways to punish people
Yes.
for different reasons, including this is like, I didn't know this until this documentary, that he put him and Stephanie in a street fight match 6 days before her real life wedding.
Correct. And Linda told Vince, if she gets a black eye or anything's broken, I will be divorcing you.
Leaving you. Right. So, and that seemed to be a little bit of a hey, screw you, and like, and I mean there's other things they talked about,
So
other, he had real life storylines that came up that were related to things that were happening in real life. I mean, how could we forget? I don't care what they say, having CM Punk's termination letter delivered on his wedding day is
was
a thousand
purposeful.
percent
Purposeful.
purposeful.
Yep.
There's
Agreed.
no way that wasn't
No.
done on purpose.
No.
Like, there's just no way. So, and what else has he done? I mean, there's always been the stories that even though he talked highly of Dusty Rhodes and how he considered Dusty Rhodes potentially before Hogan to come in to be their new face and champion, there's always been the story that because Dusty at some point rejected Vince and stayed where he was, that when Vince finally did bring him in, he put him in polka dots just to embarrass him.
Yes.
And then there's the story that Hakeem, the African Dream, was supposed to be a spoof on the American Dream.
Yes.
At the time, right? And I mean, I know he did it for TV too, but they talked about in this documentary, like, the thing about the billionaire Ted and the huckster and all that, that was also a little bit of a, oh, you guys went over there, like, screw you, I'm gonna make fun of you, like, and it ended up being good for them in the long run, but it was probably born out of wanting to take a shot at them because they didn't do what he wanted. I mean, how do remember fake Diesel and fake Razor Remote? Like,
yep. Yeah, it's something, right? Like, it's, I don't know. Like,
so yeah, I mean,
if anything, they did a very good job of tying these all together, right? Like the way it just kind of, like, it would talk about something in a previous episode and then tighten it up at the start of the next episode. And there's just so much to go over. Like, we could do a podcast for hours on this and it still would not cover, I think, 50% of what was talked about. But yes, just to regain my thought, Vince did put himself into a street fight with Stephanie 6 days before her wedding. I think that was episode 4. And I think that was because she turned down a storyline idea that he came up to her with. Which, do you want to get into that real quick? How
sure.
messed up that was? They asked Stephanie, are there any storylines that kind of crossed the line and you would not do? And she said, yeah, but I don't want to talk about it.
And then he told it.
And then so the storyline was Vince writing a story for a Raw segment. Stephanie got pregnant. He was the one that impregnated her. And I guess he got upset because Stephanie said, no, Dad, I can't do that. And he kept telling her it's good for business. Right there, I would just think he's guilty. Like, that's the first thought that came to my mind. He's guilty. But I think the problem with him is he can't. I think once he got successful, he's never been able to blend. Or he's never been able to separate Vince McMahon from Mr. McMahon, the bad guy, right? It just. He wanted to be Mr. McMahon, and he finally got there. And then
it's funny because it's funny to me because the series started with him trying to say that, the character and the person are two different people, and then
people don't know who he truly is.
Right. And then it ends with him saying, yeah, it's just the character, it's just the real person with the volume turned up, right? Is the character is me with the volume turned up, and like he kind of admits it at the end, or the way they portray it at the end. So I, yeah, I mean, well, there's a few things that I think make him seem pretty guilty. I mean, that's one of them, and then that you already mentioned it, like the three brains, and one
Yeah,
of them is
it's a full
thinking
computer
about,
full of sex.
right, and they're like, well, what is it thinking about? And it's like something really fun that has to do with sex, and it's like, oh god, it's just like, and that quote is from 2021, I think, like that interview, like
Yeah,
they were good about putting the dates on.
well, because they had a
And
pause 3 or 4 times, right? So that's why they did
sure,
it.
but I mean also making sure that people understand, like, this was 2 years before these allegations
Right,
were made public, right?
ties it all together.
But
Yep.
yeah, and it's like, I mean, you just hear that now, and it's like, man, that didn't age well, like, like at all. Um, it's
Well, and it kind of the way that Dave Belzer explained it. Vince came out after the screw job, which we all know, and tried to explain it to the crowd, right? And then because that's the first time, I guess, it kind of got out what actually happened behind stage, or, behind the curtain. So everybody knew Vince was shitty for doing this. It came out that, what Vince was trying to do. Vince talked about it. He realized all the heat he was getting from this, and that's kind of like the birthplace of Mr. McMahon. Because he understood if all these people hate him, they're gonna keep coming back to see this character that they hate, right? Because they want to
yeah,
see this guy fail, or they want to see him get beat up. So it's kind of like the screw job, kind of just opened the door for Vince to walk through and become crazy, you know, as all ever. And of course, we hear the patent. I didn't screw Brett. Brett screwed Brett. Which I
yeah.
should get that tattooed somewhere on me. But
At the time, it was great, great line.
yeah, yeah. But and then I don't know. And then he talked about like how he always wanted to be a performer, but his dad would not let him. And he says, when it happened, it felt natural, and the McMahon character was born. Um, but the funny thing is, right? This is kind of where we get into the debate between Vince and Eric. Eric kind of wants Vince to come out and say, "You saw what I was doing a year before you became on the screen and became Mr. McMahon. Just say you were copying, right?" Because he became the bad owner. Because a year prior, it was Eric that was who's the
Right.
bad guy in charge of the NWO, calling all the shots. It's technically the NWO is technically in charge of everything because they have Eric Bischoff with them. And it's funny to hear Eric go back and say, and if you kind of think about it, the DX is just a watered down version of NWO. And then Vince being a bad guy with Austin, just kind of copying what we had with WCW and the NWO battle. So it was
Yeah.
kind of funny to like hear, like, I mean, what, I don't know, the top two wrestling brains in wrestling history, you'd have to say, if not top two, top five with these two. So like it just it was kind of funny to hear them bicker about it without being in the same room. I would loved if the documentary somehow got them both in the same room to talk about this to see if they're like to see just how fired up Vince would still probably get because he would. You know what I mean? Like he would, and he made a comment about it too that he said, you know, um, that like if Eric wants the credit that he was the bad guy before me, sure, go ahead. Like, but like the way he said it, it was kind of like you knew it
Yeah,
pissed him off
he
to talk
doesn't.
to it. Yeah, and
Right,
he doesn't
he
believe it.
doesn't believe it.
Yeah,
He certainly doesn't believe it, and also, like, I don't know if they didn't, show him Eric's comments directly or not. Like when you think, remember the Last Dance documentary? Like they would
Yeah,
hand Jordan an iPad and say, "This is what was said," and they'd show him the actual
I
clip, not just "Oh, Isaiah
took it
said this,"
personal.
right?
I
Right.
I took that personal. Yeah.
So I don't know if they did that or not, but Eric admitted, "Oh, he did it way better than I ever did." like,
Yeah.
but he still took. He goes. He took our ideas and did them better. Like, because I'd call DX a watered down version of the NWO. I think it was a much different version, but after a while, it was a much better version too.
Yeah, but I mean, I could see Eric's point, right? Like WCW took off because of the big stable, the NWO, and then WWE kind of used the stable with DX and everything else going on to take off. But I mean, I can see it. I don't know if you can argue about it all you want. Like, I don't think it actually matters in the scheme of things. I just love how much it pisses off Vince. Like when it gets brought up. Like that's my favorite part of it. Um, so basically, they talked about the beginning of the Attitude Era, right? And just how they were getting destroyed. Taker talked about it that ever since like he began with WWF, they were focusing more on like that kid demographic, never that 18 to 39 demographic, right? And Eric actually was able to get out in front of them because Eric wanted to be different. That's why he asked for the live show every week because at the time WWE was still on taping. So if he was able to go live and have a different type of product to grab that demographic that nobody's been using, like, you know, obviously he was going to be better.
Yeah.
So it's cool just to see all these like how all of these tiny business details actually tie into the full story of the Vince documentary. Um and then obviously they talked about Paul Heyman talked about how Vince would use the smaller promotions to be like the farm league for players to get called up. And they talked about it numerous times, or they talked about it in great detail. Sorry, that how what Paul and Steve were able to accomplish in such a short amount of time is why Steve got called up, right? From ECW, and then he became Stone Cold Steve Austin. Which I forgot the part Stone Cold was gonna win the King of the Ring because Hunter got in trouble.
Yeah.
I forgot
The
that's
curtain call.
yeah. I
Yeah. He was the
I
only one
read
punished for the curtain call.
yeah I read the book from Rock's favorite writer, and I still forgot that's why Stone Cold got the push at the King of the Ring. So that's pretty funny. Um, but it was kind of funny to hear Steve say, "Yeah, I was sent to the hospital because I got busted open for 13 stitches. I got back, and Patterson tells me, "Hey kid, you're gonna go over," or Vince tells me you're gonna win the King of the Ring," and then it comes to find out it's because Hunter got in trouble. So he was told you're gonna have to learn to eat shit and like the taste of it, which is like, and not to just keep jumping back, but it's it's kind of funny to me to see how aggravated discussing the curtain call still makes Taker, right? Because he says it killed the business that day. Because he says I'm an old school guy, so like I wish I like he said I wish I was there for it because I wouldn't let it happen. But
Oh,
it's
no.
not.
I mean,
It
I don't
it
know.
it was
I get it. I get it, but also it's like,
but I think this is what they all don't, and we've talked about this, right? Everything is destined to change, right? So if it wasn't the
right.
curtain call, it was going to be something else that changed it, right? It would have been the dirt sheet that basically got published about the screw job that made everybody pissed at Vince, right? Because then that would have been the thing. Because then you would have had the dirt sheet telling everything that's happening behind the curtain. So it's like it was for WWE to survive, it was eventually gonna have to hit something big like that, and it was gonna have to change. Like that's what it comes down to, right? So, yeah, I mean, there's so much to talk about in 4. It's like, and then they discussed like Tyson's involvement, and then Stephanie forgot that Mike Tyson was already arrested for rape at the time. She's like, "Oh, he wasn't involved with the company when he had the rape charges, right?" And the producer's like, Stephanie, he was already in jail for that." So like, she had no idea that Tyson was fresh out of the pen, and
Yeah, that wasn't her best. Well, that was an old interview too, but that
yeah,
wasn't her best
right.
moment.
No, but like, and then they talked about how they pushed the Rock, and they were just feeding the Rock down everybody's throat. That's why they hated him. And then he eventually became part of the Nation of Domination because of that. And he just asked to speak to the crowd. And then towards the end of the episode, it got sad because we got to the Owen Hart drama. Right? Like, and I never heard Brett like say this out loud, but I can't imagine what he felt like because he left, right? As we all know, he was already gone at the time. Um, he was already gone at the time. How he felt WWE murdered Owen Hart because he left.
So that's the first time I've heard it. I've watched a lot of this. I don't remember him ever saying that until then, and maybe I just missed it. That he actually thought they purposely murdered him to
Yeah,
get back
that's
at
what I
her.
mean.
I didn't. I don't think I've ever heard him say that before. I don't know if I've just. I mean, he's probably said it on like the random podcast, but I feel like it would have been bigger news when he said it. I couldn't believe it when he said that because I was like, "You really thought they purposely dropped Owen from the ceiling to get back at you?" Like,
Brett said
I
it
mean,
took the
Vince
sheriff
McMahon. I mean, yeah, no, yeah, like
calling him
Vince
personally.
McMahon is pretty screwed up, obviously, but that's another level of
Well,
screwed up.
and
That's maniacal, right? Like I was like, he said that, and I was like, did I just hear that properly? Like, did he just say that?
yeah, it's fucking wild, right? Like it's like,
I mean,
and it was a good
negligent.
episode, but like to end, well, not that, well, the episode itself ended on the Owen Hart stuff, which is always going to be sad, right? Like it's just because then in 5 we could talk about that some more, but um, yeah, and I know that Martha Hart settled her lawsuit like in the early 2000s with WWE. I just must have missed this at the time. I didn't know WWE had a lawsuit that they settled with the manufacturer of the harness shortly after as well.
That part I knew. I forget where that, like, what that's been in before, but that part I knew that they sued the manufacturer. She sued everyone, right? Like, because she sued the manufacturer too, and she
Yeah.
sued the WWE. Um, Maybe it was in the Dark Side episodes that I had heard that the manufacturer got sued by both.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean that just
So
that just was
it's just
wild.
sad. It just rips your heart out like every time you hear it, right? But before we move on to episode 5, what were your thoughts of Vince's comment about the show? Like what he was going to do for the show?
As far as continuing on,
Because he said the audience didn't know that he was dead.
I mean,
So
that
that's
part's true.
yeah, but
That
that's why
part,
he continued on. And then he said,
yeah,
if I was to die at a show, everybody knows the show must go on. Like, and
yeah. I
it
mean,
it was so easy for him to talk about it though, right? Like it was so like it was a no brainer. Like the show, no, we're here. The audience are there. The show has to happen.
yeah, I don't know. I have always been like 50-50 on that decision, and now I think about it and I think about like the Bills game with DeMar Hamlin and the Bengals, and they like stopped that game,
Yeah,
and they almost weren't going to. And the way I look at it is, the more I think about it with the WWE, I just like it doesn't really bother me that they didn't stop it. And then when I think about the Bills situation, it also doesn't bother me that they did stop that game and not finish it. Right. Like I just I think that's a tough one. I think it's a tough one in the moment. I mean, the reasoning of like, well, the crowd didn't know, whatever, like you could announce it and you could do an immediate,
yeah,
moment of silence
yeah,
and all that. But um I don't know. I maybe I'm just callous or whatever. I don't have a problem that they continued. I certainly wouldn't have had a problem if they canceled the show right then and there. Um, I think it's I for sure believe that Vince would have continued even if it was Shane. Like they said that too, because Bret Hart said, "Well, if it had been Shane who splattered on the ring, I bet you he would have stopped the show." I don't. I think he would have continued it
yeah,
for sure. I think his decision to continue, it didn't really matter who died. Like that was just gonna happen. Like he was gonna continue. Um,
yeah.
Now of course, if it was him, it wouldn't have been his decision. But um,
I just
I
think
don't know.
my problem was like, or what irked me about it was just how easy he was able to say, "No, the show has to happen." Right? Like, and he didn't really go into detail about it. He just said the crowd didn't know he was dead. You know, they all were there for the show. We're gonna put on a good show. I think that's what bugs me about it is that like he was just so easy to. Do you know what I mean? And I hated the fact that they kept using the term splatter. That bugged me for some reason.
Well, yeah. I mean, but Brett started with that.
No, yeah, right. Yeah, no, but that's what I mean. Like
Yeah.
just in general when they talked about Owen splattering, I'm like, Jesus.
You know what I didn't realize, and I must have just missed it. In the past, they usually talk about how a little bit of the ring was like broken from where he had landed and
Oh, I
stuff.
didn't know that.
Yeah, like Undertaker has talked about it, and somebody else has talked about it. I don't know if it must have been on the either the dark side or one of the other more um prominent like shows that talks about his death. Where he landed, like there was a little bit of like a break in the ring, and I think it was the Undertaker who mentioned in one of these interviews saying like, they kind of had to stay out of that corner a little bit because it just wasn't, whatever.
Hmm.
And on top of it, it's where, and they have a clip of the Undertaker looking at that corner during his match. But what I didn't realize previously was that his blood was there too. I guess I never realized he actually bled. I thought it was just like blunt force trauma that had killed him. Um, which I'm sure that's what killed him. But I mean, like I didn't realize he actually was bleeding on the mat, and that was very apparent. They showed it once or twice that there was blood on the edge of the mat there. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it was rough, man. It was rough. So excuse me. Um damn, we only got two more episodes to talk about. And I feel like we still haven't come close to touching everything. You know?
Oh, the last one is the big one.
5 was about family.
Yeah.
So 5 begins with Heyman referencing McMahon's childhood. McMahon never outright said it, but there was talk of him possibly being abused by his own mother as well, and his stepfather. The stepfather, he definitely said would smack him around, and he said he just had to take it. I never knew Vince was the one pushing for Stephanie to get with Hunter, because every time I heard Stephanie tell about it, I Stephanie would say Hunter had one, or Vince had one rule: you cannot fraternize with the wrestlers if you want to stay in this business. So the fact that Vince was kind of like pushing it to happen is kind of ironic to me, based on what I've heard in the past from Stephanie herself. They never talked about Triple H cheating on China. That was never mentioned whatsoever. Which,
No. Although, I mean, but it doesn't really have a place in this
yeah, Rich,
documentary.
right. But I thought we might get like some mention of it, just based on how she was tied in. But once again, that's one person they don't like to really talk about too much. And it was more or less like this episode starting off with Stephanie talking about, like, it was weird for her dad to ask her to do some things that she did on the screen. Like, it just made her feel uncomfortable. She said at the time she felt, yeah, I'll do whatever I got to do for the business to be successful. But now she said, I sit back with my kids now and I look at that and I'm almost like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, there's a lot.
There's
Actually,
a
there's a
ton.
lot.
Um, and then they brought in Linda for the second or third time, right? Because they brought in how, like, Vince
Yeah.
basically forced everybody to be a character once he was a character, and Linda was more the business side, right? What went on with the actual business? Vince was creative, and Linda begged him to not make her become a character because she was bad acting and she knew it. And it was funny to hear Vince get on the screen and say, "Yes, she was a bad actor." Um, and then it gets into just how just kind of all 4 of them butt heads at the time. Um, and they talk about the street fight, which you brought up earlier, which is crazy. You're gonna get in a street fight with your daughter 6 days before her wedding, and the clip, out of all the clips they could have showed from that street fight, the clip they showed is Vince with a steel pipe, basically choking Stephanie with it against her throat. Right, like that's a hell of a clip to pull from that street fight. That's a
Yeah.
hell of a clip. Um, and then we get into one of the lawsuits, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a few.
Yeah, a few. There's been over a dozen, I think. But this one was with Sable, and how the storyline basically affected her career, and uh, the lawsuit was basically for a sexual harassment charge against WWE, the corporation, right?
Mhm.
And what that entailed. Um, and it kind of got weird here to me. Let me hear your thoughts on it. But it kind of looked like Vince paused a second when they were talking about this, almost as like if we couldn't tell if the affair with Sable was real or storyline. What's your thoughts? Right? Like, it got awkward a bit.
Right.
So it's
Right.
like it just kind of like, oh, okay, so did it start with Sable? Like, was that the first big name, right?
Yeah.
And like we heard for years, Linda and Vincent haven't lived in the same house for 15, 20 years. So I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's tough. It's I don't know. It's. I mean, what's your thoughts on this episode? Like, this was so basically the big things were Bob Costas getting pissed off, which made me laugh hysterically. XFL, the stock exchange, but then also the Sable and Stratus storylines. What did you take from this episode?
I think it was just right. This was the setup for the bombshell, you know, sixth episode where it was going to focus on look, there's NDAs all across the board. You know, they thought it was one, and then we find out it was multiple, and you know, now it's going to get real salacious, and then boom, like, and even just when you thought what else could come, then boom, we get a crazy lawsuit. You know that ends him, completely ends his career twice. Really, the same issue ended his career twice. Once a little more secretively because we just knew there was an NDA and we didn't know the details. And the real issue was that he had kind of paid for it improperly.
Yep.
And then it was like, oh, well, hold on, because here comes the details. And oh shit. Like, oh shit. And then all of a sudden, all the interviews stop. And now we're only going to get interviews that were from 2021 and 2022. And then boom, that's it. We're done. Nobody else is going to speak on this.
Yeah, it is nuts, man, right? Like, I don't know. It's well, like, how did you feel about the Trish Stratus interview about her cheating with Vince? Um, and then the thing she had to do, like the barking like a dog, right? Like that got brought up.
Yeah.
And then how Linda was the one to tell her to kiss her on the forehead when she was sitting in the wheelchair.
They're all effed up. They're all effed up. They really are. They all were to
Yeah.
a degree, right? And to go back on your comment, at the end of the day, Shane might come out of this looking like the most normal person out of all of them, but Stephanie, I think, is a close second. Linda just is what it is, and like, and obviously, then Vince is just like crazy.
Well,
But
Linda seems to be, she got caught up as a victim of the business, right? Because she gave everything for the business to be successful, so it took care of her family. And at least, like, we'll get to it when Stephanie finally decided if he's coming back, then I'm stepping away for good. Like, you could tell she got her right judgment of, like, I don't want to be involved if he's involved, right?
yep,
So, yeah. I mean, do we think there was an affair with Trish? Or do we think
in real life, I I don't think so.
no? Because I don't think so either. Because it wasn't as awkward as what the Sable one was. The Sable one was very awkward when they were talking about that. Extremely awkward. Um. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's yeah. So they talked about everything they did to go public. And then before they talked about like the downfall of WCW and you know and Vince being on the plane to basically go sign the papers to take over WCW. Yeah, it just I feel like I'm not hitting a lot in here. Um and then it got brought up how they got sued for using WWF, right?
Yeah, which, I remember obviously was a thing, and like whatever. I mean, it sucked. He was pissed about it, but then they also turned that into gold as well. Like, remember the whole "Get the F Out" campaign?
Yeah.
Like, that was, everybody loved that play
Yep.
on words, right? Like, "Get the F out." Like, as a kid, I remember, or young adult, whatever you want to say. I remember that just being so funny because it's like, oh, these guys are saying a roundabout way of saying get the fuck out. Like
Yeah,
basically, like
without
this is
actually
great.
saying, "Yep."
This fits in perfectly with the Attitude Era. Like literally fits in perfectly with the Attitude Era.
And then they talked about which I thought was a weird tieback. I get why they did it, but I thought it was a weird tieback. But they did talk about, like, Vince was said his business comes first, and I guess that's the statement he made when, or yeah, his business comes first was the statement he made when they were talking about, like, several people that came back to work for WWE, right? Case in point, they brought up the fact that Sable was brought back to work. And in the promo that Stephanie did with them in the office, Stephanie was basically yelling at Vince, "Why is she back here? She tried to sue us for everything that we have. She tried to sue WWE for everything that we have." Um, so it's it was kind of funny that once again it shows like Vince has no issues with taking anything that happened in the real world and turning it into a storyline. Um, and which he clearly did. So, and then this episode talked about the debut of John Cena because it was start of because Vince used the term when talking about WCD that it was the ruthless aggression that helped him take over WCW. And that was kind of the term that was being thrown around in the locker room, right? Because Vince was having these pre-baiting shows, and as he says it, he basically told everybody, "Come on, I need one of you to step the f up and to be the guy for the future. I have nobody now that's the guy for the future." Um, and then yeah, I mean, and then it was kind of funny. I knew Cena talked about this on interviews with Howard Stern before, like how his whole rapping gimmick was because of WWE personnel hearing him do it, and then that's when they're like, "That's what we're gonna go with." But I didn't
Really,
realize,
just Stephanie.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I never knew that part that they were on the bus back somewhere,
Oh, really? Yeah.
and he
Yeah.
went to sit at
I've
the
heard
back of
that
the
before
bus.
too.
Yeah, and then Stephanie was like, "Would you like to do that on TV?" And then that's what he started doing, which was kind of funny. Um, in here, Stephanie refused to discuss the proposed incest storyline with Vince, but Vince laughed and chuckled about it, Dan. Why are we not surprised? You
Yeah,
know?
he's a sick fuck. He
And
really is.
yeah, and then Shane wanted to show him like he could run a business before like taking over WWE. So what was the business that Shane wanted to buy, Dan, at the time? Do you remember?
The, the UFC.
And Vince basically said that would have taken a lot of money to do. At the time, Shane had a little amount of money, so it would have never been successful.
Yeah. I mean,
Which could be true because like hindsight's 2020, right? Like
well,
you,
sure, hindsight's always 2020, but I think as long as he had left it, intact of not having it be entertainment, I still think the rise and growth of it would have been astronomical.
see,
I
but
think it's certainly a missed opportunity.
yeah, I would say you can put it down as a missed opportunity, but I think you would need Dana to do that. And I think Shane's too far from Dana. Dana is closer to Vince than what Shane is, I would say.
Yeah, maybe.
And like
Yeah.
they just like they're both gonna go down as visionaries of their sports, right? Like as the guys that pushed it forward, that got all the big deals, that got everybody paid, right? So like yeah, and then that kind of you could kind of tell that pissed Shane off. Shane basically had a talk with Vince and said, "I think this is as far we go." Um, and Shane bounced for a bit. What was it, 7 years, 8 years, or something? And Shane taking a step back from WWE was the final topic covered before a preview of Janelle Grant's lawsuit. And now, the big finale.
which had a lot of tough stuff to talk about.
Whoa. Let's just get right off the bat. I hope you got your Bible by you, Dan. Because here we go.
It's terrible.
I know. I just had to. The real life storyline of Vince's exploding limo halted by one Chris Benoit. And I had to explain to my wife what happened because she watched this episode with me.
You had to explain to her what happened with Chris Benoit?
Yeah, that was rough.
She didn't know?
No.
All these years with you and she didn't know the Chris Benoit references?
No. She probably doesn't care, but that's probably part of it too. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It is do you think they so this is probably another 50-50 thing like we talked about before of similar to the Owen Hart thing, but do you think they jumped the gun giving the 10 bell salute to Benoit before they knew what actually happened? Do you think they should have waited till everything came out at that time?
I think the problem was that they, I don't know if I'd say jump the gun because I think the timing was terrible, right? And obviously they didn't wait. And this is certainly a situation where hindsight is 2020 and ridiculously clear hindsight. But I think the problem, because that Raw was taped, right? They didn't, so they taped that in the afternoon, I
Was it
thought.
tape?
Well, I think it became taped because remember it started with just Vince in an empty arena, and then they rolled to a memorial. I don't think it was live, and so they would have taped it in the afternoon, and they didn't have a lot of info yet, and it wasn't uncommon. I mean, the sad part is it wasn't uncommon for wrestlers to be found dead in their homes and hotels, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, well,
so
because of all the
so of
partying,
course,
pills, drinking,
right. Well, and yeah, and just the years of toll
wear
on
and
their
tear.
body
Yep.
from steroid use and all that.
And that
So
fake CTE that doesn't exist.
yeah, that too. So I mean, obviously they didn't wait long enough, but also, he was found on Monday morning, right? Like, and clearly it didn't get back to them quickly enough. And that, look, this isn't well, it's a murder, but this isn't like what we think it is, right? Like that comes later. And maybe they just thought it was suicide, like straight suicide. I don't even know. Like, that part I don't know that we've ever necessarily heard exactly what they thought it was when they taped the memorial. Um so yeah, I mean I think that one's a tough one, like to go back and judge them on it, like, in the moment, because you never had to wait before, right? So
Yeah, no, I just. Yeah, it's. Yeah. Well, because that was a big
so
discussion about everything, right? Like, should they wait? Like, that was brought up in all the interviews with the wrestlers, right? Like, when they spoke to Cena and they spoke to everybody else and Brian Jarowitz, like, should they have waited?
yeah, I mean it's so hard to answer that question now because obviously the answer is yeah, they should have, but
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
know? You
Right.
know?
Yep. But then the wrestler who became a brain doctor, Chris Nowinski, said Benoit had the worst CTE he has ever seen. or that's ever been documented.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is where it kind of got like weird or like aggravating, because this is when Austin talked about he doesn't believe in CT, and then Taker said he was mad when they got rid of chair shots because that was the go-to thing in wrestling, was taking a chair to the head. But then he said, "But I understood why it happened." So what are we talking? So if you understood why it happened, why is it that big of a deal then? Like you just watched one of your coworkers decimate his family from all these reports that you're reading, and you're not a believer, but you understand why it happened. Like I just think at the time the comments could have been better. Of like, no, we get it. Like you know. And then Vince, I think Vince referred to Chris as just going crazy.
Just being troubled. Yeah.
Yeah, troubled,
Just being,
and he just snapped. He said,
yeah, he just people are just some people are just
"Just yeah, right." That's what he
yeah,
kind of wrote it
like
off as, and
have
I'm like,
have issues.
yeah, and I'm like, holy hell.
But I mean, I mean, in addition to that, I don't think it was in this episode. I think it was in a prior episode, or maybe it was in this. But, I mean, he also kind of is in denial that Undertaker had a concussion the night he lost the streak. And it's like, dude, you left WrestleMania to go be with him in the hospital,
because his
which has
wife
never
was
happened
crying.
in
Right,
the history of wrestling, that you leave a show,
right,
but you left it for him. He collapsed in the backstage. He had no, by his own account and his wife's account, he didn't even know his name at 4 a.m. the next morning.
correct. That's how bad it was.
Yet you're gonna say it was just because he was in shock that the streak was broke? Like, I
Do
mean,
you
talk
think
about
this
not
is?
being in touch with reality.
Yeah. Do you
Like,
think that's what it is, or do you think it's just Vince's brain so cognitive that focused on I got to protect the business? Because
no,
he's
I
obviously
think he's
lost.
just
He's
I
just
think he's
lost.
just I think he's like Austin, that they're just in denial of CTE is really a thing. Like,
Yeah.
he even said, like, he offered to help Nowitzki's research, but he wanted it to be fair sourcing and all that. It's like, dude, like, he's looking at the brain of the guy who is potentially the worst ever to suffer from it, and all he's seeing is death of the brain. Like, what are you talking about, dude? What's not fair about what he's doing? Like, it was almost like, I'll help you, but I'm hoping that my help is going to direct you to the answer I want to see, which is that it doesn't really exist.
Well, and it was crazy that Vince started to talk about it as like Chris is signaling out the WWE when Chris specifically said they've spoken to the NFL, they've spoken to the Premier League, they've spoken to WWE. Like
He
he's
even mentioned there's still fighting soccer on
yes,
this.
yes,
And
like
the NFL has finally come around, but other
yes,
sports have not yet.
yes,
Yeah, which is crazy.
yeah.
Absolutely crazy with everything we now know. Like, I, absolutely crazy. But I just can't believe he said that about the Undertaker. Like, if you wanna say, and I mean, Heyman doesn't deny that CTE exists. He just doesn't give a shit about CTEs as an excuse. He thinks Chris was just a bad person too,
Yep, which
or
is fair.
became a bad person.
Which is fair.
But so the Chris thing, fine. If you want to try to argue that Chris was predisposed to being a psycho and it just didn't come out until that day and time, then fine, right? Like, we can talk about a lot of people that do bad things and we don't necessarily know why they do them, right? There are murders committed every day and we don't always know why. And not all of them are related to CTE, obviously. So fine. But I was shocked that he tried to say that really the Undertaker doesn't he doesn't remember the match because he was in psychological shock that I was breaking the streak, which it's always been pretty well understood that Undertaker and Vince are about as close as it gets when it comes
It's a
to
father son,
this.
and that's the first thing
Right.
they say. anytime it's
Right.
discussed. Father son.
Right. And to that end, it shocks me that Vince would say that about a guy that he clearly has so much respect for, he clearly loves, he clearly felt an incredible closeness to. He broke his own rule of being featured in the Hall of Fame to induct him. He was choked up trying to induct him, right? Like, not your typical Vince McMahon when it comes to The Undertaker. He cried during the Last Ride documentary,
Hmm.
right? Like, and you know he didn't want to do that, but he
No.
did it anyway because he had, like, he couldn't help himself. And then to say that shocked the hell out of me, to be honest, that he thinks that's real. And so I guess it could be what you're saying. It's the ultimate protect the business.
I just think
I
he's
just
so
think
lost in it.
I think he, yeah, I just think he doesn't believe in CTE, and
Yeah.
he doesn't want to paint the picture of a concussion being that lethal of an issue and that problematic, where a guy who's been doing this for 30 plus years couldn't remember a match, right?
Yeah.
Like, and still to this day doesn't remember anything from, by his own words, 3 o'clock in the afternoon until he woke up in the hospital. He has no recollection of what happened. Basically, it's all gone. And when he watches the match, he has no clue that he did any of that stuff in the match. So
Right.
I found that to be very odd. I wonder what the Undertaker honestly thinks about that, because it's like, dude, I'm willing to admit like that I was effed up. Like, I don't know, that was weird. The Chris thing is weird. Like, I mean, it's weird with the way Austin talked about it. It's weird the way McMahon talked about it. I just I don't get that at all. And I don't even know what else to say about that part. It just was crazy.
Yeah, it's yeah, I don't know. It's tough, right? Because we owe the sport that we love the most to Vince McMahon, right? But now we're starting to see like he's lost in the character, or he's always been lost. Yeah, because they talked about the streak, like you said, and brushed it off, and then they shifted to the PG programming and the women's revolution, which they spoke about it for only like a brief period of time, which I thought was kind of weird. Um, Before they jumped to the fact Shane came back, and then it kind of seemed like Shane coming back versus the Undertaker was kind of like the ultimate. Okay, you have to show me you want to be back, type thing, right? Because Shane had to put his body through hell for that. So it's kind of um I don't know. Like it just felt like that was Shane's like Shane Vince basically put Shane to a test. If you want to be back and you want to prove you're about the business, you're gonna have to go into the ring with one of the best to ever do it. And then they briefly talked about that, like you said, that the Undertaker talked that he would take a bullet for Vince, but case in point, you also need to remember this was like that part. Taking the bullet for Vince was talked about a while before everything broke from all the stories. So, in the timeline of everything, I don't know if it's changed. I haven't heard Taker talk about Vince and what his thoughts are. Um, and then they went on to discuss like they spoke to Hogan, Michaels, Booker T, and Cena, and they basically talked. Do you ever see Vince retiring? And they said no. And then they asked
Yeah,
Vince
they
and
all
said
said
no.
no.
Yeah. And then I love how they did this next part. The next segment, though, they immediately jumped to the retirement in 2022 and the return in 2023. It's kind of like putting his foot on the fire now of like, well, this is what happened. You know. And to go from there, they spoke to everybody's least favorite sidekick, Pritchard, as he was interviewed for the final episode. After it sounds like they gave him all the episodes to watch as they got done with him, because they asked Pritchard, or which this would be hysterical if they only gave Pritchard all the episodes to watch and they only wanted feedback from Pritchard and they used this as an opportunity to like piss him off, because they said Pritchard was interviewed for the final episode and he said it was a piece of shit, right? Like he said it was done shitty and he hated it because it made Vince look like a bad guy. And it didn't talk about how when his wife had cancer, Vince made sure his wife got the best treatment. And, you know, talking about his wife only having 4 months to live turned out to be she was still currently living, right? Like,
Right.
So, but then it's kind of like when Pritchard talked about that, like, I'm glad his wife got treatment, but it also felt like Pritchard just trying to use his wife as like hey, Vince isn't a bad guy because he once did this for me type thing, rather than like actually wanting to accept what is being out there about Vince. Yeah, I mean, and then it basically just talked about people discussing Vince's legacy. And a majority of these interviews I researched and found out were done in 21 and 22, so a while before all of what came out. But what's your thoughts? Like, what is like, where do you think his legacy is now?
I mean, his legacy is in the toilet, right? Like
It has to be, right? Like
right.
it.
I mean, it is. I mean, there's just no, but it's well, this case hasn't even really started yet.
Well, because it's
This
paused because of the feds are involved, which I didn't
right.
realize. I thought they were
Yeah. So,
going on at the same time.
well, I think they explained it too, and I had read this somewhere within the last couple of weeks. She's voluntarily like pausing it so that they can do more investigations because they might even find more, you know. Um, but so yeah, no, his reputation and his legacy like is in the toilet because of this. But it's the same thing that we talk about with Benoit, right? Like, you know, they will never like officially be erased from history, and it's easier to erase Chris Benoit as best you can. You can't really erase Vince, right?
That's the problem.
Like
Yes, agreed, 100%.
you just can't, because WWE is what it is because of him. Now, what it's becoming from the last year or so on won't be because of him, but it would have never gotten here without him,
Right.
for sure. And you can never take that away from him. But, barring some crazy revelation that she was lying the whole time and that's provable, which I doubt, but whatever, like he can never return to it. He'll never go in the Hall of Fame, which is going to be weird to a degree. But you can never officially forget him either. So it's tough. So his legacy's in the toilet, but there's always going to be a little bit of Vince McMahon is the greatest wrestling promoter of all time. Like that's not going to change. I
And
don't think.
I think that's the only thing that can be said is like, yeah, he did all this with WWE, but he was a huge piece of shit, right?
Oh, for sure.
And
For sure.
then, yeah, the final episode just ended with them saying Vince is currently under investigation for allegations of sexual misconduct, trafficking, and Brock Lesnar has not commented on his involvement in Grant's lawsuits is on hold while the Federal investigation is ongoing. I don't know, man. Were you expecting, like, overall, what's your thoughts? Were you expecting this much to come out from it?
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't think there was any other than these little like tidbits that we heard that maybe we didn't know all the details about or things like that. I don't think anything like was that surprising, or that I didn't think wouldn't be included. I in some, in a summary of some of it, I don't it's hard to say I agree, but I don't disagree with Bruce's last interview that they did with him, right? Like he was a little standoffish. I'm sure he regrets a little bit of that now, knowing, what has come out. But I agree that it certainly wasn't meant to be a balanced look
Of
because it
like,
really
yeah,
it really did no positive of Vince. Like while crediting him for the incredible growth of the company and the profession of wrestling and being the greatest promoter of all time and changing the business and evolving wrestling and all that and seeing it before others saw it, while it kind of touched on all that, it found a negative thing to talk about in every step of the way, right? Like while saying, yeah, he was on the brink and somehow pulled WWE out of the toilet and crushed WCW to the point where he bought it, they found all these negative things to filter into that time period, right? So
yeah, that's
I'm
true.
not, and I don't necessarily have a problem that they did it that way. Like that just is what it is. But it's not a full look at him, and it's only one story. But Bruce's story is something that never gets talked about. That
Yeah,
Vince made sure that Bruce's wife had the absolute best cancer treatment she could ever have, and he credits him with the reason that she beat a 4-year life expectancy with a 24 years of life so far since the diagnosis,
yeah,
because they got in early, they got the best treatment when treatment maybe wasn't as advanced as it is today, and here we are. They briefly mentioned the wellness program,
yep,
right? But the wellness program is now a great thing that the company does, but that was his decision to do it for guys that don't even have to be with the company anymore, right? Like, we'll send you to rehab even if you work for TNA. Like, we don't care. You were our guy one time or our female one time. You need help? Let us know. We'll pay for your rehab. I mean, those are just small things, but you know, but I read, I don't know if it's true or not, but I had read that, when they first started filming this, it was meant to be all encompassing. It was going to talk about the good and the bad. And then obviously it shifted as time went on and then everything came out. So they flipped it to
yeah.
just the bad. And that's fine. I mean, look, he deserves that for sure. You know?
I was
Um,
I was just about to ask you that. Do you think it's their way of, like, the way that the Ringer put it out there of like, well, based on what Vince does, Vince isn't going to get the best of both worlds. Vince is going to get what is being talked about. Because I think the Ringer was in charge of it.
um, I think so too, because the
Bill
Ringer
Simmons.
is yeah, it's Bill Simmons' company. Yeah, I think it is. I think so. So, look,
Yeah, let me double check that, but I think it was them.
no, it definitely was a Bill Simmons thing. I
Yeah.
assume he used um I assume he used that company to do it. Um
Oh, yeah. So it was by Chris Smith, who did Tiger King, and then executive produced by Bill Simmons. Okay, that's what it was.
Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, yeah. He deserves it. Or at least he deserves what's coming to him. There's going to be a lot. I think. This isn't probably the last time we'll see some sort of documentary on him. I'm sure we're going to see.
Yeah.
I don't know if they'll do a second one that's post lawsuit.
Yeah,
As
depending
this
on what
progresses.
happened, right? Like,
Yeah. Um, I'm sure there'll be more, and it is what it is. Like, my guess is you're not going to see too much cooperation going forward
no.
from WWE people, or former WWE people. Some of them maybe, but not all of them. Um, oh well, like that's what he gets. So I don't even care that it wasn't more well rounded. I just like that would be an interesting documentary too, to see the good and the bad. You know.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, we might get there one day, I think, but
yeah, maybe.
I think it's gonna have to take a lot to get back there, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, that was our spiel on the Vince McMahon documentary. Go watch it for yourself. It's very good. If it's 6 episodes, you could get through it as fast as you can, because it's very, very good. It's one of the best ones out there, and not just because we watch a ton of wrestling still at our age. It's just very well put together. The way it just ties all these stories together, and there is kind of like Dan explained, you know, a you know, a kind of spiel towards Vince, which I guess, like we said, definitely deserves. Um, but yeah, it's gonna be interesting. It gonna be interesting. I guess the other things to note, right? This past week in wrestling, Jey Uso finally got a title. Got the IC title. Thoughts? Well, I think it's
Yeah,
well
I
deserved.
think it's great.
He's
Yeah.
been putting in the work. The crowd loved him. Um, at Bad Blood, we're gonna get Dominic in a shark cage. Awesome, awesome idea. The custody battle that we called out. What? I don't know. 7 episodes ago. We're finally
Right.
getting. So thanks for tuning into our stuff, WWE. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. But yeah, I mean, and then we're getting towards Bad Blood, Cody and Roman. We could talk more about what to expect from Bad Blood next week, but you think it's gonna be good real quick? Do you think Bad Blood's shaping up to be good based on what we saw tonight from SmackDown and what we can expect
Yeah,
going into?
I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be good too. So yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of caught in the 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 Vince McMahon spiel because I rewatched 2 episodes last night as I was going to bed. Um, you know, just to rehash on them, and I think that's going to be one of the shows I continue to go back and watch time and time again because it was that intriguing. So yeah, but anything else you want to talk about, Dan?
No, I think that's it.
That's our Vince McMahon episode, like every other
That's our
wrestling
Vince.
podcast. Which, to
Yep.
be honest, that was the only big thing to talk about, right? Grand Slam didn't really do too well for AEW. Um, it's kind of stale, and viewership wasn't good. Jay got the title, like we said, finally, as as the #1 fanboy of Jay Uso, finally got the title. Um, so Rhea and Liv dominate the Shark Cage. I'm all for it. Damien versus Finn. I'm all for it. You know, a lot of good wrestling to watch. I think as much as I spoke good of AEW the past couple of weeks, I think this Grand Slam is a big hit to their credibility of just like They took a step back, but should be interesting. You know, Dan? Should be interesting. And we got a Bad Blood viewing party that Saturday on an 85-inch TV.
Do you really think they took a step back? I mean, they had 700,000 viewers. That's about what they get.
But it was... I know it was a step back compared to what it was last year. Like the comparison.
Well, yeah, I mean everything's
But no,
a step back from
yeah,
last
but
year.
no, I'm just from what I saw of the card, it didn't really grab me. I mean, we could talk about this right now. What were your thoughts on it? Did it keep you interested?
I mean, the only thing I'm interested in now is what they're doing with Moxley for the most part, right? So, yeah, I didn't think the show was like anything different than anything else they've done. Like the problem for them is like they do it up like it's this special event, but it's really
just a regular show.
Yeah, it's not that special of an event, and that's fine. Ratings wise, it was on par. They were ranked third for the day. Kind of hard to beat the Indiana Fever at this point. That's who they were up against.
Watch what you say about Caitlin Clark there, Angela.
I'm saying, like, they, I wouldn't have expected them to do well against that game, and they were up against it, and they were also up against the other game. So, and those games, I mean, the Fever game, according to this, was 2.5 million viewers, and the Mercury and Lynx game, which was on after that, was 1.2 million. Dynamite came in third behind those two. So, numbers wise, I think they did what was expected. Attendance was like 9,000, I read.
Okay. Down
from, I think, 12,000 the year before, or 11,500 or 11,800, something like that the year before. Yeah, I mean, it was just a regular old Dynamite, I think. It wasn't anything special. The Grand Slam part, doing it in Arthur Ashe, like, the notoriety of that is worn off. I think that's where that goes.
I would say that's fair. That's fair.
So, but whatever they're doing with Moxley and Danielson, it's going to be interesting. They're gonna do the match at Wrestle Dream as we expected. So we'll see where it goes from there. I don't know yet what they're doing.
That's October 12th, right? The Saturday after Bad Blood.
I think so. Wrestle Dream. Yeah, October 12th. So, we don't really have a card for that other than a couple of matches. Yeah. So, I don't know what they're going to do with that yet. If they're going to have Moxley win or not. They might, and he might just ride off into the sunset for a while and then pop back up a year from now to get his revenge or something at maybe the next.
Wow.